the Jewish Channel's Week in Review. A Palestinian teenager recognized among Israel's victims of terror, a new look at thousands of lives saved during the Holocaust, a famous Broadway lyricist, and more of the Jewish news that's changing your world right now in this episode of the Week in Review. Hello, and welcome to the Jewish Channel's Week in Review. I'm Stephen I. Weiss. A Palestinian teenager has been officially recognized as a victim of terror by the State of Israel. Mohammed Abu Khader, a 16-year-old who was kidnapped and burned to death last summer, allegedly by 3 Israeli Jewish men who have been indicted but not tried, was listed as a victim of terror in the official plaque at Mount Herzl in Jerusalem, as well as on the Israeli government's website listing victims of terror. It is unclear if Abu Khader is the first Arab victim of Jewish terror to be recognized in this way by the Israeli government. As part of this recognition, Abu Khader's family will receive compensation identical to that of families of other victims of terror in Israel. In testimony to police, one of the 3 alleged killers, the 29-year-old Yosef Chaim ben David, said the kidnapping and killing was in retaliation for the kidnapping and killing of 3 yeshiva students, allegedly by operatives paid by Hamas, saying, quote, "We said they took 3 of ours, let's take 1 of theirs, and we decided to pick someone up, kidnap him, beat him within an inch of his life, and discard of him. We plan to hurt a soul, meaning to kill, to torture him, and kill him." In an intra-Jewish religious conflict, ultra-Orthodox men engaged in violence to try to stop women reading from a Torah at the Western Wall. The effort by women of the Wall to read from a full-size Torah scroll for the first time at the Western Wall was aided by male allies who passed the Torah scroll over the mechitza from their side to the women's side. A violent protest saw ultra-Orthodox men crashing through the mechitza. As JTA reports, the mechitza, quote, was breached by those who ostensibly care about it most. And in another shift against Orthodox norms in Israel, the vast majority of Israelis in a new poll declared that they want public transportation to operate on the Jewish Sabbath. 74% want some form of public transportation on Friday nights and Saturdays. Of those, 52% said it should operate at a, quote, decreased level. When broken down by political party, the results seem even more unequivocal. 72% of Likud voters agreed, as did 89% or more of parties that received significant support in the recent election, except for 2 groups, the settler-associated Beit Yehudi party, which had only 47% support for public transportation on Shabbat, and ultra-Orthodox voters, of whom only 2% voiced such support. And speaking of public transportation and the ultra-Orthodox, an ultra-Orthodox request to have a subway ad removed in New York has been rejected. The ultra-Orthodox New York City Council member, David Greenfield, asked the Metropolitan Transportation Authority to remove the ad for Lane Bryant clothing that features several women in bras and panties from the F subway line that travels through the ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods of Borough Park and Midwood, but that also has dozens of other stops in a city of 8 million people. The ads were considered immodest by the ultra-Orthodox, but the Transportation Authority has said they will remain for their full run. Moving on the heels of Holocaust Memorial Day, a new book explores efforts that saved thousands of lives, as Rebecca Honig-Friedman reports.
When most of us hear the term righteous Gentile, we think of individuals like Oskar Schindler, who saved Jews during the Holocaust. Lesser known is an entire community of righteous Gentiles who together saved thousands of Jewish refugees during World War II. Located in an isolated area of the Haute-Loire region of France known as the Plateau, the people of Chambon-sur-Lignon and its surrounding villages together gave refuge to and helped save approximately 3,500 Jews, and by some estimates as many as 8,000 people total, during the German occupation of France.
Not one single Jew was betrayed in Le Chambon-sur-Lignon. Not one single Jew was denounced.
Peter Gross is the author of the new book, A Good Place to Hide: How One French Community Saved Thousands of Lives During World War II. I had a chance to speak with this Australian-born journalist who now lives in France to find out more about this extraordinary community. So tell me about Le Chambon-sur-Lignon and the surrounding communities. You make a point of
Including them all, yes, absolutely.
What went on there during the war? Tell me a little bit about how they saved people.
Okay, well, we have to start by saying that this is quite an isolated community. It's right over on the eastern side of France, in the hills, not that far from Geneva and not that far from Lyon to locate it. And it was an enclave of Huguenot Protestants. So these were people who had 250 years of being belted around the ears and generally knocked about. And their cultural tradition was of of persecution and of resistance. And so in the course of World War II, Jewish refugees heard about this place and came, and they were taken in.
The people of the plateau were inspired by their own history of being persecuted, but also by their pastor, André Trocmé, a lifelong pacifist.
Basically, he was able to persuade the villagers of the rightness of their action in hiding Jews. And he preached this famous sermon saying we must fight the Germans, not with guns, not with swords. We must fight them with weapons of the spirit.
But not all of the Chambon's residents were pacifists like Trocmé. The armed resistance developed a base there, and eventually played a role in fighting the Germans and securing France. But at first it focused on what was called the rescue operation, finding shelter and supplying false identities and papers to refugees, and smuggling Jews across the border to Switzerland. Gross tells the story of some of the key figures in this operation, like Catherine Cambacedes, a teenager who smuggled money into the plateau for the rescue operation, Virginia Hall, a one-legged American journalist who became an operative for the British intelligence service, the SOE, and Oskar Rosowski, a Latvian Jew who became a prolific forger, supplying false papers to anyone who needed a new identity.
How did they get away with this for so long? You had an entire community where it seems like almost everyone had to at some point have sheltered some Jews or other illegals.
I think the biggest thing they had in their favor was geography. Basically, if anybody sent a raiding party, they could be seen a long way off. There was plenty of time to get the people who were in danger out of the houses and into the woods. And of course the Huguenots, they had shelters there from their time of persecution, and they kind of revived 200-year-old caves and 200-year-old dugouts that they'd kept on standby in case things turned nasty for them ever again. And they were able to hide Jews and the people who were dodging the forced labor laws in these things. So the first thing is the isolation of the plateau.
For more from Peter Gross on A Good Place to Hide, watch the full broadcast edition of the Week in Review.
Thank you, Rebecca. A new biography of a famed Broadway lyricist is out, as Meredith Gansman reports in a segment from our theater show, Row J.
The first revival of On the 20th Century from the Roundabout Theater, starring Kristen Chenoweth and Peter Gallagher, brings the music of Jewish composer and lyricist Cy Coleman back to the boards. But the author of a new biography about Coleman, Andy Probst's fascination with the songwriter goes way back.
I have been in love with his music since I was like 7. One of the first shows I was taken to was a production of Sweet Charity. And it was the second show I'd seen, captured my imagination and my ear.
Coleman was a prodigy who grew up in the Bronx.
His mom, Yetta, owned a couple of tenement buildings. And this is the height of the Depression. And one of her tenants skipped out. And they took everything with them except for one thing. It was an upright piano. And Yetta was not about to let that go to waste, so she brought it down into the apartment. And Cy, who wasn't born Cy Coleman, he was born Seymour Kaufman. He just started playing. He had perfect pitch, and he started plunking out songs that he'd been hearing on the radio or what have you. And it turns out that this is the story, and it's been repeated by a number of people, so I have to believe it's true. The milkman heard him and said, you know what? This kid has talent. You should get some lessons.
And the rest is musical history. Coleman's repertoire includes such standards as Witchcraft and The Best Is Yet to Come. Coleman made his Broadway debut in 1960 with Wildcat, starring Lucille Ball.
Bad debut, and the song that everybody remembers from that now is Hey, Look Me Over. And so I think that Cy always wanted to write music. I mean, Phyllis Newman said that he had just music bubbling out of him. And I think that he just doved toward Broadway because at that point in time it was still the popular music of America.
For more on You Fascinate Me So, The Life and Times of Cy Coleman by Andy Probst, tune in to the full broadcast version of The Week in Review.
Thank you, Meredith. Finally, this week on Up Close, what makes Jews lose their sense of place, and what can give it back to them? For Boston College political science professor Alan Wolf, the answer to where Jews should be comfortable is straightforward: in the diaspora, where they've primarily been for the past 2,000 years. We discuss his book, At Home in Exile, Why Diaspora is Good for the Jews. And then, for Shira Dicker, finding comfort at an American campus has been a bit of a challenge. She shares some of her experiences in a novella, The Jerusalem Lover. Here's some of the highlights from my interview with Alan Wolf. So diaspora is good for the Jews. Is it better for the Jews?
Well, before 1948, that really wasn't a question, right? It was only diaspora. So Israel complicates the subject, indeed. I would answer your question by saying this: if someone could have asked me what would be the ideal demographic distribution of the Jewish people in the year 2014, I would have said roughly half in Israel and half outside. And that's exactly what we have.
Let's then go to the premise of the question, which is to say the idea that diaspora is good for the Jews assumes there's someone out there saying diaspora is not good for the Jews. But here we are, and as you said, you've got more than half the Jewish population, 67 years after the founding of the State of Israel. Obviously, the Jewish community has voted, and it has voted that it likes the diaspora in a significant, to a significant degree.
Yeah, but as I'm sure you know, I mean, that would have been a vote that would have really driven many of the early Zionists to despair. You know, what people call the negation of the diaspora, which was such a key idea for Bialik and for all these fascinating Zionists. I find myself endlessly interested in the early origins of Zionism. So there was this tendency to use language to describe diaspora Jews that was worse than language that anti-Semites would use. They were rats singing, or they were scum. I mean, the words are just unbelievable. A lot of that is gone, but it hasn't all gone. You know, I wouldn't associate Ben-Gurion with that kind of thinking, but when he was Israel's leader, he would periodically make speeches. You know, we want your children kind of speeches. And these days we have Hillel Halkin and A.B. Yeshua saying very much the same kind of thing. So it's not an idea that's completely gone away.
Right, and not just poets and novelists and writers, A.B. Yeshua and Hillel Halkin, but we have the Prime Minister of the State of Israel recently telling French Jews, you know, you don't just think of us as a place to pray to. Think of us as your home.
Right.
And there's a strong endorsement of the idea that Jews are not doing so well outside of Israel, and that they should be in Israel.
Well, I think what I find most interesting about that, the appeal directed toward French Jews, is that it has nothing to do with Judaism. It's come here because it'll be safe here. It's not come here because we're a Jewish state or we honor the Jewish tradition. I mean, one of the great early Zionists, Ahad Ha'am, thought that to move to Israel just to escape anti-Semitism to the Yishuv was a bad idea. You should move because you're drawn there by something.
You can see the full episode of Up Close on the Jewish channel on cable. You can also listen to the full audio of Up Close as a podcast available on iTunes or in your favorite podcast player. That's all for this week. From all of us here at the Jewish Channel, be well. The Jewish Channel is available on cable. Time Warner Cable Channel 1640, IOPLING Channel 505, RCN Channel 268, Cox Cable Channel 1, Bright House Channel 330, Verizon Fios Channel 900, and on Comcast and the on-demand menu on premium channels. For more information, visit tjctv.com.